I knew her coffee order by heart. Dark roast, no sugar, a splash of oat milk that she'd switched to 3 years ago and never mentioned again, as if expecting everyone around her to simply absorb the update. I knew which elevator she preferred, which conference room made her tense because the lighting was wrong, and exactly how many minutes before a meeting I could slide a printed agenda onto her desk, without it feeling like I was breathing down her neck. That was the job. Anticipate. Disappear. Repeat. Her name was Helena Marsh, and she ran the Western Division of a mid-size infrastructure firm out of Calgary, with the kind of precision that made other executives look like they were still figuring things out. She was in her mid-40s, sharp in a way that felt almost physical, and she wore her authority the way some people wear expensive coats, like she'd forgotten she had it on. People adjusted themselves when she walked into rooms. I'd watched it happen for 14 months. I was 28 and her executive assistant, which meant I was the person who knew everything and said nothing. I handled her travel, her calendar, her correspondence, the uncomfortable calls she didn't want her name attached to. I once spent an entire Saturday rescheduling 3 back-to-back investor meetings because a snowstorm closed the Trans-Canada through Rogers Pass, and she sent me exactly one text the whole day. Sorted? I replied yes. That was the conversation. The morning everything changed, we were catching a connecting flight out of Vancouver. Small regional aircraft, 12 seats, heading to a remote lodge in northern BC, for what her team called a leadership offsite. What it actually was, 2 days in the mountains pretending to bond over whitewater rafting, while the real decisions got made over scotch after dinner. I had been there the previous year as the person who arranged the kayaks and confirmed the dietary restrictions. This year I was attending, technically, because Helena's deputy had gone on parental leave, and there was no one else she trusted with her files. She was across the aisle from me, reading a briefing I'd prepared the night before, making small marks in the margin with a pen she kept in her left breast pocket. She hadn't looked up since we boarded. Outside, the mountains were low cloud and dark tree line, the kind of scenery that's beautiful until it isn't. The pilot had introduced it himself as Kendall. Friendly enough voice. He'd mentioned the weather was fine, maybe a little wind over the range, nothing to be concerned about. He was wrong. We were 40 minutes in when the aircraft lurched sideways so hard that my seatbelt went taut across my chest, and Helena's briefing pages left her hands and hit the window. Not turbulence, this was something else. The engine sound changed underneath us, a rough, uneven grinding that you feel in your back teeth before you understand what it means. Kendall. Helena said it calmly, the way she said everything. No answer from the cockpit. The plane dropped. My stomach went somewhere below my feet, an overhead bin popped open and a laptop bag swung down and hung there swaying. Ladies and gentlemen. Kendall's voice came through the speaker, and the casual tone he'd started the flight with was completely gone. I need you both braced and seated. We're having a mechanical issue. Bracing position now, please. Both. There were only 2 of us back here. I looked at Helena. She looked at me. For 1 second, just one, I saw it. Something underneath the composure. Not panic. Just the frank acknowledgement that this was real and she knew it. Then the nose angled down, and there was nothing to do but hold on. I don't remember all of it in order. I remember the sound of the trees before I saw them. This rushing, tearing noise that seemed to come from everywhere. I remember the impact going through my whole spine. I remember Helena's voice saying something sharp and short that I couldn't make out over the noise. I remember white sky tilting to brown earth to white again, and then a stop so sudden it felt like being caught. Then silence, then smoke thin and white, drifting from somewhere near the front. I got my belt off faster than I thought I could. My right shoulder screamed when I moved it wrong. The cabin was tilted, one wing low, and 2 of the windows on Helena's side had gone opaque, not broken, just starred over with cracks that turned them white. She was still in her seat, eyes open, one hand gripping the armrest. Helena. She turned her head slowly, focused on me. I'm here. Can you move? She tried and then stopped. Her face went tight. Ribs, she said. Just that. I worked my way up to the cockpit door. It was jammed partly open by a bent panel, and the smoke was worse there. I called Kendall's name twice. The 3rd time I pushed the door far enough to see, and I understood that he wasn't going to answer us. I backed away. He's not coming, I told her. Something moved across her face, gone before I could name it. Then we move, she said. We got out through a gap in the fuselage where the skin of the aircraft had peeled back on impact. The air outside was cold and smelled like pine and engine fuel and overturned earth. The trees pressed in close on 3 sides, dark and enormous, and the ground was soft and wet under my shoes. My phone had no signal. Not one bar. Just a little clock in the corner telling me it was 11:14 in the morning, like that was useful information. Helena stood a few feet from the wreck with one arm wrapped around her midsection, looking out at the tree line. She was still wearing her blazer. One of the sleeves had a tear from shoulder to elbow. Someone will know we went down, I said. The flight plan was filed. She said it like she was confirming a meeting time. They'll ping the transponder, if it's transmitting. She looked at me sideways. You could let me have that one. I almost said sorry. Instead I said, let's get what we can from the cabin before anything catches. That got a short nod. We spent the next hour pulling out everything usable. Water bottles from the galley, a first aid kit bolted under the rear seat, 2 emergency blankets in a red pouch, 3 protein bars and a bag of pretzels from the snack compartment. A spare jacket that must have been Kendall's, 2 flashlights. Helena tried to lift a heavy case from the overhead and went still with pain. Leave it, I said. There's a hard drive in there. Leave it. She looked at me the way she looked at people who had just overstepped. I held the look. The smoke from the front of the plane was thicker now. Fine, she said. We moved uphill, away from the wreck, to a natural shelf of rock that gave us some cover and a view of the sky. The ground there was damp but firm. I spread one of the emergency blankets out and set the supplies on top of it. Helena lowered herself down against the rock with the controlled caution of someone managing pain they weren't planning to mention. Let me check that, I said, nodding at her side. I'm fine. You said ribs, I said fine. I crouched in front of her anyway and held up the small antiseptic wipes from the kit. There was a cut above her right ear, not deep, but it had tracked blood down to her jaw. There's this at least, I said. She went still while I cleaned it. Up close without the office and the controlled light of a boardroom, she looked like herself in a way I hadn't seen before, less performed, just tired and cold and real. You've got bruising along the left side, I said. I know. If it gets harder to breathe, I'll tell you. A pause. Thank you. The afternoon was cold and got colder. I made 2 more trips to the wreck and came back with a seat cushion, a small bottle of hand sanitizer, a pair of Kendall's work gloves, and a bungee cord I had no specific plan for but kept anyway. Helena was on her feet when I returned the second time, moving slowly around the perimeter of our little camp, looking at the tree line. There'll be water somewhere below us, she said. Elevation drains. Tomorrow, I said. Tonight we stay close. She didn't argue, which told me more than words would have. I rigged a shelter using the second emergency blanket, the bungee cord, and 3 branches I cut with the small folding knife from the first aid kit. It looked like something a 12-year-old would build and be proud of for 10 minutes. Helena watched me work without commenting. Have you done this before? She asked eventually. No. Scouts? I grew up in Mississauga, I said. Closest I got to the wilderness was the Rattray Marsh. That got me something, not quite a smile. Close. We split a protein bar and drank water slowly and carefully, the way you do when you're not sure how long it has to last. The sky through the trees turned orange and then gray and then dark, and the temperature dropped faster than I expected for August in the interior. The mountains hold cold the way granite holds cold, without apology. Night in that kind of place isn't quiet, it's loud with the wrong things. Wind in the high branches. Something moving in the brush maybe 30 meters out. The crack of the cooling aircraft somewhere below us still settling. I keep thinking I can hear a helicopter, Helena said. She was sitting beside the shelter entrance, both knees drawn up, the spare jacket over her shoulders. Me too, you don't have to agree just to be kind. I'm not. She went quiet then. Do you think they've started searching? I looked up at the dark between the trees. I think they know we didn't arrive. She absorbed that. That's not the same thing. No, I said snot. For a while neither of us spoke. The cold settled in harder. My shoulder ached down to the elbow. I shifted closer to the shelter entrance and she didn't move away. In the office, she said after a long pause. I have an answer for everything. Even when I don't, I have one ready. I know. This is the first time in a long time I don't. She said it quietly like she was filing an observation rather than admitting something. I don't know what's next. I don't know who's looking. I don't know if that shelter holds. It probably won't, I said honestly. She turned and looked at me in the dark. And yet here we are. Here we are. She was right about the shelter. Around 2 in the morning the wind came down off the ridge in a way that felt personal, a hard sustained gust that snapped one of the branch supports clean and brought the whole thing down sideways. The emergency blanket made a sound like someone crumpling tin foil, and then it was gone, flapping away into the dark. Rain followed. The mountain kind, cold and total as if the sky had been waiting for the right moment. We scrambled for the bags. Helena was on her feet before I was, moving despite her ribs, grabbing the supply blanket off the ground before it soaked through. Rain ran down her face and flattened her hair, and she looked at me through it with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Not anger. Not control, just raw and present. Rock, she said. She meant the overhang I'd noticed earlier, a shelf of granite about 40 meters uphill that jutted out far enough to give real cover. I grabbed the bags, she grabbed the blanket and the remaining water. We moved. By the time we got under the overhang, we were both soaked through and breathing hard. She sat down against the stone and didn't try to straighten up, or look like it was fine. I sat beside her and spread the dry blanket across both of us, and we stayed like that while the rain hammered the trees in front of us. After a while she leaned against me, not dramatically, just shifted her weight until her shoulder was against my arm and stayed there. I didn't move, I barely breathed. "My daughter is 8, she said. I hadn't known she had a daughter. "Her name is Margot." She stopped. "She's with her father this week. He'll hear about the crash and—" She didn't finish it. "She'll hear you're being looked for," I said. "That's different from the other thing." A long silence. Then, "You're right." The rain went on. We shared the last protein bar, both of us pretending we weren't hungry. The blanket was barely enough, but it was something. The cold was winning slowly, the way cold does, not dramatically, just persistently, and after a while I put my arm around her shoulders to keep the blanket tight and she didn't say anything about it. "You've never once told me I did a good job," I said. It came out before I decided to say it. She was quiet for a moment. "No, 14 months. I know how long it's been." I stared out at the rain. "Did you think that?" Another pause. "Yes," she said. "I thought it often. I just assumed." She stopped. "I assumed you knew. People don't know what you don't say, Helena." She turned slightly. "That's the first time you've said my name like that." "Like what?" "Like I'm a person." I didn't answer. She looked back out at the rain and the silence between us felt different from all the silences in the 14 months before. By morning the storm had moved through and left everything silver and still. We were damp and stiff and the supply situation was getting honest. 1 bottle of water between us, half a bag of pretzels. The first aid kit down to basics. We needed water today. "I'll go down the slope," I said. "Sound moves uphill. If there's a stream anywhere below us, the birds will be near it." "I'll come." "I'll come," she said again, quieter but the same. We went together. Slower than I would have moved alone, but I didn't argue again. The undergrowth was thick and wet and the ground kept shifting under our feet on the slope. She grabbed my arm once when she lost footing on a patch of loose shale and held on for a moment after she'd steadied. An hour in we found a creek maybe 4 feet across, moving clear and fast over smooth rock. I stood there looking at it for a second longer than I needed to, just because it meant we had more time. Helena crouched beside it and filled both bottles with her bare hands, and we used the purification tablets from the kit and waited the 20 minutes in near silence. She looked up at me while we waited. "Do you have anyone?" I wasn't sure what she meant for a second. "Someone who'd be at home right now watching the news." "My mother," I said. "In Oakville." She nodded slowly. "She'll know you're being looked for." "Yeah." I looked at the water moving over the rocks, same as Margot. That landed somewhere. I saw it in her face. The walk back was harder than the walk down. Her ribs were worse, though she'd never say so. And by the time we got back to the overhang, she was moving carefully enough that every step was a decision. I spread the blanket on the driest patch of ground and she sat without being asked. I was arranging the refilled bottles when I heard her say, quietly, "I should have told you." I looked up. "That you were good." She was looking at her hands. "I should have said it out loud instead of assuming you'd somehow know." I set the bottle down. "Why didn't you?" She thought about it. "Because the people who are good don't need to be told. That's what I always believed." A pause. "I'm starting to think that was very convenient for me." I sat down across from her. "Yeah," I said, "it was." She looked at me then, and didn't look away for a long time. The second night was clearer than the first, cold but dry, the kind of cold that's honest about what it is. We rationed the water and split the pretzels and talked slowly, the way you talk when you've run out of performance. She told me about how she'd built the division from a struggling regional office into what it was now, 12 years of it, and how some days she sat in her own boardroom and felt completely alone. I told her about my father, who died when I was 23, and how I'd taken the first stable job I could find and just stayed in it because stability had felt like love for a while. She listened to that the way she never listened in the office, still, fully. Like she had nowhere else to be, which, technically, she didn't. "You could do more than this," she said, "than the job you do for me." I looked out at the dark between the trees. "Because it was safe," I said, and safe started to feel like enough. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, without turning her head, "I'm glad you were on that plane." I looked at her. She was still watching the trees, jaw set, like she was bracing for her own words. "Even with this," she said, "I'm glad it was you." That was it. That was the moment the shape of things shifted, not with a kiss or a declaration, but with those 2 sentences and the silence that came after them, and the fact that neither of us moved to fill it. Rescue came on the afternoon of the 3rd day. We heard the helicopter before we saw it, that mechanical rhythm cutting through the tree line, first faint and then suddenly huge. We were both on our feet before we thought about it. Helena moved faster than her ribs should have allowed. We scrambled out from under the overhang and into the open ground below the rock shelf, waving, shouting. She had the reflective side of the emergency blanket, and I had the flashlight on strobe, and somehow they saw us. The SAR team, search and rescue out of Prince George, came through the brush in orange jackets and moved with a practiced efficiency that made me feel like the last 3 days had been something from a different world. They assessed Helena first, asked their questions in the clipped professional way of people who do this weekly. She answered everything precisely and clearly, and only once reached out and touched my arm, briefly, when they started moving her toward the extraction point. They airlifted us separately. I watched her go first and stood in the clearing until the sound of the rotor faded into the mountains. The hospital in Prince George was clean and bright and relentlessly ordinary, in a way that felt disorienting after the rock shelf and the rain and the creek water and the dark. I was treated for a dislocated shoulder they'd partially reset wrong the first time. Dehydration, a deep bruise along my right hip, and lacerations on both hands I hadn't noticed until someone pointed them out. A nurse told me I was lucky. I thought about saying I know and didn't. I asked about Helena the first afternoon. The ward nurse said she was stable, resting. Her family had been notified. I asked if I could see her. She said Miss Marsh was resting. The next morning I asked again. I was told her representatives had requested limited visitor access while she recovered. By the second day the word had changed. Her team was managing her communications. Her office appreciated my patience. There was a man in a gray suit who I'd never seen before who introduced himself as someone from corporate services and gave me a card and said the company was grateful for my remarkable composure during a very difficult situation. Remarkable composure. Like I was a flight attendant getting a commendation. On the third day in the hospital, a woman from HR called my cell and told me the company wanted to ensure I had full support during my recovery and transition. She said transition like it was a neutral word. She said the organization was reviewing its operational structure in light of recent events and wanted to make sure I had every resource I needed. She mentioned a package. She mentioned a confidentiality agreement. She used the phrase mutual best interests twice. I told her I'd need some time to review anything they sent over. She said of course, and the warmth in her voice went just slightly flatter. I was discharged and put up in a hotel in downtown Prince George, company card, fresh clothes someone had bought in my approximate size and left on the bed, a fruit basket with a card signed by people who had never spoken to me directly. The separation agreement arrived by email that evening. Extended benefits, 3 months of salary continuation, several clauses about public statements, media contact, and the company's right to characterize the incident in its official communications. I read it twice and didn't sign it. I tried calling her. The number I'd used for 14 months, the one I'd texted from airports and hotel lobbies and the parking garage at the office at 7 in the morning. It rang 4 times and went to a voicemail message I didn't recognize. Professional, impersonal, like it had been set up by someone else. I emailed the address only a handful of people had. The reply came from a legal address I didn't recognize, informing me that Ms. Marsh was in recovery and all professional communications should be directed through the company's official channels while she was on medical leave. I put the phone down and sat with that for a while. The version of the story that appeared in the media was clean and small. Calgary executive and assistant survive aircraft emergency in northern BC backcountry. Both treated and released. Search and rescue praised for rapid response. There was a photo of Helena outside the hospital, coat on, looking like herself, one hand raised slightly in a gesture that wasn't quite a wave. There was no photo of me. The caption said she had praised the professionalism of the crew and the search and rescue team. It said nothing else. I left the hotel after a week. I didn't take the company car they'd arranged. I took a bus to the airport and flew home on my own money to my apartment in Calgary and sat in it for 2 days barely moving. Then I sublet it, packed a bag and moved to a furnished place in Canmore, $600 a week. A view of the back of a strip mall. A radiator that kicked on at 3 in the morning and woke me every time. I told myself I was recovering. Some mornings that felt true. I thought about her. Constantly at first, and then in the way you think about something you're trying to stop thinking about. Which isn't less. I thought about the way she'd said, "I'm glad it was you," looking out at the dark, bracing for her own words. I thought about how she'd leaned into me under the overhang without making anything of it, which somehow made it more significant than if she had. I thought about Margot, 8 years old, and how Helena had said her name in the rain, like it was a weight she was carrying alone. I didn't try to contact her again. I figured if she wanted to find me she could, and if she didn't, then the company had done exactly what companies do, which was take something real and administrative it into nothing. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. I was at the grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon, the big Safeway on Main Street, standing in the cereal aisle not really looking at anything, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go. Then I picked it up. Silence for a moment. Then, "It's me." I stood very still in the cereal aisle. I'm outside your building, Helena said. Or the building you were at. Your landlord said you'd moved. How did you find the new place? I called your mother. I didn't say anything for a second. You called my mother. She was very helpful. A pause and then, almost right. She said to tell you to call her more. I left my basket in the aisle and drove back. She was standing outside the building in a dark coat, no driver, no assistant, hair down, hands in her pockets. The controlled version of her, the one that ran division meetings and made rooms reorganize around her arrival, was somewhere else. This was just her. Tired and real and there. I got out of the car and she watched me cross the parking lot with an expression I couldn't quite read until I got close enough, and then I could. Relief. The kind that makes people look younger. They monitored everything, she said. Not formally. There was no policy. But my assistant's calls were flagged for review, my email response times were tracked, my schedule was rebuilt around supervised recovery. Someone in the boardroom decided I needed to be steered back to stable, and stable meant no contact with you. Did you fight it? She looked at me steadily. Not fast enough, she let that sit. I told myself I was being practical, that what happened out there was context, that real life was different. And then I stopped sleeping. She looked down for a moment, then back up. And Margot asked me why I was sad and I said I wasn't. And she looked at me the exact way my mother used to look at me when I was lying, and I realized I was becoming someone I'd already decided I didn't want to be. The wind came down off the mountains behind the strip mall, cold and specific. I told the board I was taking a leave of absence, she said. Effective end of the month, medical and personal. I have the years and the credibility, and frankly I have a lawyer who knows exactly which conversations happened in which boardrooms, so they said yes. I watched her face. Helena. If you're here because you feel, don't. She said it the same way she'd said it on the phone in the rain, not sharply, just final. Don't do that. I stopped. She took a breath. I spent 3 days under a rock shelf in the mountains with someone who was honest with me when I had no way to punish them for it. That doesn't happen in my life. It has never happened in my life. She looked at me directly. And then I spent 4 weeks letting people convince me that it was proximity and adrenaline and trauma response. And every day I believed them a little less. I didn't say anything. I came because I wanted to, she said. Because I thought about what you said about safe feeling like enough, and I didn't want that for you, and I didn't want it for me either. The radiator in the building behind me was already audible from the parking lot. The strip mall was nothing. The view was nothing. But she was standing in front of me and she had called my mother to find me, and that was the realest thing that had happened to me since we walked out of those trees. You should probably come up, I said. The fruit basket place was nicer, she said, looking at the building. There's no fruit basket, I know, she almost smiled. I'm coming up anyway. She did. And when I made coffee, dark roast oat milk, no sugar, because some things you just know. She sat at my kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out the window at the back of the strip mall and said nothing for a while in the comfortable way of someone who had finally stopped. Pretending silence was something to fill. I sat across from her and let it be. It wasn't the rock shelf, or the rain, or the fear of dying that made it real. It was this. The Tuesday afternoon, the ordinary kitchen, the coffee getting cold while neither of us moved. The way she looked at me across the table like she'd already made her decision and was done second-guessing it. That was the thing they couldn't put in a confidentiality agreement.